Okay, good afternoon, everybody. It's Maynard. It's close of business. And wow is all I can say about today's show because we've got a very special guest. I know I always say that. I always mean that. But today we've got Michael Schellenberger with us. Michael is a Time Magazine Hero of the Environment. He's a Green Book Award winner, and he's the founder and the president of Environmental Progress. You may have also heard he's the author of the best-selling new book, Apocalypse Never. I'll read you a quote about the book. There have been so many, but this one really struck me. This may be the most important book on the environment ever written, writes climate scientist Tom Quigley. There are a bunch of those kind of quotes. We'll get into the book here shortly, but Michael, welcome. We're so glad to have you, sir.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, Michael, we're going to do a quick rundown just to kick us off, get our juices flowing. It's like our pregame stretch. Mike Bradley, you are muted. You got to get unmuted and tell us what's going on in the oil world.
Yeah, two things, two developments here over the next 48 hours and maybe over the next few weeks. Well, first of all, OPEC Plus is going to be meeting tomorrow to see what they're going to do about their current cuts, and it looks like expectations that they're going to reduce their cuts from 9.7 million to 7.7 million. I think that is already dialed into crude oil prices. We saw some weakness earlier this week, and it's not so bad because demand right now is in supply and demand's in deficit. But the biggest concern right now is that demand is starting to kind of peter out a little bit, especially with a lot of these closings. So, from that standpoint, we expect crude oil is probably going to stay range bound. The second thing I think that is coming up in the markets is there's been a decoupling between energy equities and crude oil. And the reason why I think that is I think most commodity traders think crude oil is in decent shape here. Supply and demand is in deficit, and so I think it's trading based on fundamentals. Whereas the equities, I think energy equities have come off here recently because of concerns from two fronts. One, coronavirus cases starting to accelerate and what that means for demand. And the second, more so in the last week or two, is just political. I think you've seen polls are showing that Biden is starting to lead. Lead is accelerating. You're seeing Biden putting out proposals in energy. And I just think the energy stocks, it's too much for these guys at this point in time. So we are seeing a decoupling between the crude oil and energy equities. And that's probably going to continue here for the next few weeks. Now, on the positive side, I think what we're going to see over the next few weeks is, from a crude oil standpoint, is that DOE numbers, draws, and crude oil inventories and DOEs are going to be pretty gigantic. So, just expect that that's going to probably, at least create a buffer, maybe a little bit of lift for crude oil prices over the next few weeks.
So, Mike, you said a couple of things. Help us out. One, what does the market think OPEC is going to dial back the cuts tomorrow? Is that the pretty universal expectation?
I think a couple of weeks ago, the market was not expecting that. I think the market now is expecting that. And so if they don't go ahead with the cuts, I think that will be a positive surprise.
Okay.
And I'd like to say one thing. Just remember that Saudi has cut a lot more than their quotas already. They may not back off those. So, it's still probably supportive. So I just think that's one of the reasons why crude oil really hasn't come off here with that that announcement forthcoming.
But your comment was, as the month plays out, you think from some draws and some other numbers, you'll take the over a little on oil for the rest of the month. Is that what you're saying?
I still think we stay range bound around 40, but we're not going to see, 2 or 3 weeks ago, you would have had this announcement that OPEC was going to cut back on their production cuts. I think you'd have a little bit more heavier response. I think now the market fully expects it because the fundamentals are okay.
Okay. Let's jump over to Matt. Matt, Mike mentioned political news and some of the polls, the Biden energy plan that's come out. You started talking about that last week. I know a lot of customers, investors are talking about that. Companies are talking about that. What's the latest on the outlook for if we got administration change and what happens?
I think this is going to continue to be very topical as we head into the November elections. Really, the key focus for energy investors is, one, how does Biden potentially progress clean energy investment? And this morning, he laid out a plan where over the next 4 years, there could potentially be $2 trillion in spending. And that's obviously an area of growth that investors are looking at more aggressively from a traditional energy perspective transitioning into new investment vehicles going forward? And then two, does Biden come out with a more aggressive stance towards traditional oil and gas development? So far, from what we've seen, he's going to take a more moderate approach than I think Senator Warren or Senator Sanders would have, where in their policies
this is not saying much, Matt.
where they were potentially planning on a total frack ban across the U.S. As of now, we're expecting potentially some delays in permitting on federal acreage and potentially some cutbacks on federal leasing. But we think that's manageable as we move forward over the next few years. So as things stand at the moment, this is going to be something that we'll just continue to watch and monitor and figure out if it does have a more meaningful impact on the industry.
Matt, what are you hearing? It seems like the question people ask on Biden is, well, who's going to be in charge? That's the key question on almost any topic. Are you hearing anything about who's going to drive energy policy? Who cares the most? I think that's where you get the most speculation.
Yeah, I think everyone's still at wait and see mode on that. We need to see, who forms around him from a policy perspective, who he chooses from a VP standpoint. That's really going to be kind of the next step forward in terms of understanding the market implications from this discussion.
Okay. Anything else in your world?
I think just to follow into Mike's comments around energy potentially disconnecting a little bit from crude, I think a lot of that has to do with some of the near-term headwinds. So as you look into the refining sector in particular, we do see downside to estimates going into Q2, and there are some headwinds going into Q3 as well. That's not only weighing on the refiners, but it's also weighing on the earnings potential for the integrateds, and they are obviously a big component of the index. In conjunction with that, as we talk to investors from an upstream perspective, clients are thinking about terminal value risk in a more meaningful way. And that really does align with conversations on the energy transition. And if there is a risk of demand for oil 10 years from now, clients would like to see a higher free cash flow generation, lower growth, and lower debt in the sector. And so I think the industry is just going to have to deliver on those different metrics. And then as we look into sectors like service, even though things are starting to look a little bit brighter over the next 2 quarters, we do expect things to stabilize at pretty low activity levels as we go into Q4. So I think at the end of the day, while the equities have decoupled a little bit, there's just a lot of improvement we need to see on the financial front for investors really to get engaged on these stocks.
Okay, Colin, you're up. How's that old song go? Tell me something good. What do you got?
Well, I don't know if it's good or if it's just more of the same. Month to date, looking at the WTI forward curve, the August contract has been pretty well behaved. It's averaged a little bit above $40 per barrel. And looking at the standard deviation, it's only about 1% of that mean on a settlement basis. And that's driven down implied volatility across the front ends of the curve, which means puts have been getting cheaper. And the market has looked pretty comfortable with the idea that the recovery was on track until today. And what we're looking at is today there was a big jump in implied volatility in the 25 delta puts, in fact, really the entire put side. And looking at specifically what investors and corporates are trading, when we look at the September contract, the $40 puts had the second largest volume since February at about 2,500 lots. That's 10 times the trailing 12-month average.
So, Colin, last week you were talking about this looks like a pretty good time to put some hedges in place. Is that what's happening?
Most definitely. So it looks to us like, basically the market is aware that the unemployment insurance, the supplementary insurance, is going to roll off. We'll see if it gets extended, but the risks are mounting in that August to November period. And so producers are looking at those $40 puts and saying, you know what, they look attractively enough priced that let me add to some near-term protection. And that's what's driving that result. Okay, so guys, I want to ask you last question before we get to Michael. If we exited July at a $45 oil price, what is your theory as to why? Obviously, the demand side would be the most likely driver of that. As Mike pointed out, it's possible. There's an outside chance that the OPEC Plus cuts that have been slated the whole time to taper here in the August timeframe surprise us. But the most likely driver of a $45 price on that time horizon would be better than expected demand.
Okay, and let me ask the flip side of the question. If it was 35, what happened? And you can't say demand. Okay, you can. Are you going to tell me the same thing? COVID?
Same answer.
Okay.
Same answer. And you're seeing it across a bunch of different channels that obviously the system is built in an expectation for a demand recovery, but obviously we have this second wave, if it is a second wave of COVID cases throughout the United States. And we are seeing incremental shutdowns in California restaurants and other businesses across the country. So obviously that could impair demand more than we had anticipated for the third quarter.
Mike, last question. Why with inventory so large, why aren't we talking more about inventories being an important part of the current price?
Well, I mean, inventories are very inflated at this point in time, so it's going to take a lot to get it down. It's not going to happen over 1 or 2 weeks. It's going to take probably 9 months to a year to get down to normalized levels. So I think that's why we're not talking about it. Back to your previous question, I would say from a commodity trader standpoint, I think traders want to get positive. The reason they're not getting positive is because of the demand, like Colin said. If you start to see cases in the U.S. start to level out and start to go down, I think you're going to see a lot of momentum for traders to get back into it, simply because demand is the only thing holding them back. They feel very comfortable with supply. So I think that's going to be the catalyst to start to get crude going higher, to get it to 45 or higher. So when you start to see cases start to reverse, you're going to see a lot of traders coming along into the contracts.
Fantastic. Thank you, guys. Well, also, we've got with us today Craig Webster. Craig runs our ESG effort. We asked him to join the discussion because we knew it would be something that's near and dear to his heart. So, Michael, let me again say welcome. We're so honored to have you. And if I could, I wanted to read one quote that you have that kicks off your book. And then you've got some slides and you can lead us through it. But you wrote, I decided to write Apocalypse Never after getting fed up with the exaggeration, alarmism, and extremism that are the enemy of a positive, humanistic, and rational environmentalism. Yeah, I guess I'd say God bless you, because if we had a goal of what we're trying to do is just try to create the most intellectually honest discussion of all this stuff as we can. So you're at the epicenter of that. Let me turn it over to you. I think you've got some thoughts to kick this off.
I'll just show a bunch of slides for 5 or 7 minutes and then I'll stop and then we can talk some more. Okay, so you guys all saw the news last year, Amazon on fire, lungs of the world, according to the New York Times, and Leonardo DiCaprio produces 20% of the world's oxygen. Our house is burning, said the Prime Minister, or the Prime Minister of France, Emmanuel Macron. There was a lot of publicity by celebrities raising concerns about what's happening in the Amazon, but also more broadly on the environment, including with Gisele Bündchen, herself a Brazilian, a special focus on the indigenous. Obviously, climate change being the biggest environmental issue that people pay attention to, but also tied up with concerns about mass extinction and a real sense in which economic growth is not something that we should want more of, something maybe we should want less of. Some pretty big changes being demanded. We all saw this video of the starving polar bear. It's been shown to school children around the world who mobilized last year, millions of kids, along with this incredibly exciting environmental group called Extinction Rebellion in Britain. And most people said, look, we can just use less energy efficiency, we can go vegetarian, we can have free range beef. These are the key things to saving the environment, we were told, along with, of course, renewables, which are viewed as sort of the most important technology. So I guess the question is any of this true? Do we really know what everyone says this is true, but is it really true? Let's take a look at climate change. I mean, the first thing to know about climate change is that deaths from natural disasters have declined 90% over the last 100 years. They've declined to 80 to 90% over the last 4 decades, often with very low cost, just weather forecasting and storm shelters in places like Bangladesh. Does anybody really think that these numbers are going to reverse themselves and that millions of more people will die? No one's presented a mechanism for it. I was an invited expert reviewer of the IPCC. It's not in any IPCC report. Nobody is predicting that this decline of deaths from natural disasters is going to reverse itself. What about costs? When you normalize the costs, taking into account more prosperity, there is no increase property damage from climate change over the last 120 years. This is what explains rising costs without normalization, rising more property and more harm's way. That's all that we're seeing in the data. Doesn't mean that climate change is not happening. Climate change is happening. It does present some risks, but it's hard to see it showing up in these property cost trends anytime in the next half century, I think most scientists believe. Sea level rise, the more I look at it, the less worried I am about it. Yeah, some parts of the world, you might not be able to live on the coast, but it's not like it's happening all at once. The Netherlands became a rich country while farming below sea level, some areas as low as 7 meters, which is 14 times more than IPCC estimates sea levels will rise by 2100. Do we really think that we're incapable of dealing with that? That's the end of the world. In terms of fires, basically two things. The accumulation of wood fuel in forests and increased housing near forests explain all of the increase in damages from forest fires. There is a climate signal in the sense of longer fire seasons, both in California and Australia, but it doesn't actually explain the change. What explains the change is the buildup of wood fuel and proximity for housing. Huge increases in how much we eat. We eat too much. We have so much food. The polar bear, which didn't have enough food, was actually a bit of misinformation. We have no idea why the polar bear was starving. There's no evidence that there's less food for polar bears at all, much less because of climate change. In fact, we don't even know if there's more or less polar bears in the world. In fact, we've killed about twice as many polar bears through hunting than exist. What about everybody going vegetarian? It's not going to happen. There's about 4% of the public at any given time that say they're vegetarian. One of the most interesting things I discovered in my research is that most vegetarians say they eat meat. If you ask them, most eat chicken and beef, and most of them give it up within the first year. Grass-fed beef is the worst thing for the environment. It's the worst human impact in the natural world is grass-fed beef. If you were to set out to destroy the environment, you would actually want to promote grass-fed beef. So meanwhile, energy consumption is going up. I guess the question is, does any of it matter? Who cares? Is this just a childhood, this is just something that kids worry about or something? It's been going on since 1989, since I was a senior in high school. But it turns out that actually kids are anxiety is rising among kids. 1 out of 5 British children are having nightmares. And the worst thing is that the World Bank funding and other international development bank funding has been diverted. And now they're going after the private banks to divert their money from flood control, cheap and abundant electricity, to more expensive, and these are organized environmentalists against more expensive forms of energy. So the Amazon is not a net source of oxygen. And we have known this for 50 years. We've known this for longer. It's ridiculous. And by the way, they can't also be lungs and a source of net oxygen supply, because lungs don't produce oxygen. They actually absorb it and emit carbon. So it's confusing and wrong. The thing that everybody tweeted out was actually of a fire in 1999. Some people tweeted out photos of fires that weren't even in Brazil. The indigenous of Brazil, the Yanomami, as opposed to being victims, actually control an area the size of Hungary, which has 10 million people. So it's not the case that this is just, this Rousseauian romantic drama projected on it. We mostly haven't deforested the Amazon. Deforestation is still at historic lows. Fires are still at historic lows. What's happening in Brazil is just what happens in every rich country. There's deforestation for 1,000 years in Europe. And then over the last 100 years, the forests have come back, and the amount of forest the size of Portugal has come back. Now 40% of Europe is tree covered. You saw that there was so much agricultural intensification, growing more food on less land, that much of Spain and France reforested. And you can see that it's absorbing greenhouse gas emissions. We've seen this increased greening by about 40% of the planet. Fires have gone down. And there's great news, which is that if you keep doing this, then you can grow more food on less land in Brazil and save the rainforests. The problem has been that Greenpeace has demanded fragmentation of the rainforest. So you actually get farmers doing this kind of thing, Well, if you want big cats to roam, if you want big apex predators, you need to have a lot of space for them. You don't want to fragment, but this is what's been encouraged. Let me get to energy because that's what you guys are focused on. I mean, mostly, it's good news. Energy is a source of prosperity, declining child mortality, longer life expectancy, declining malnutrition. That's driven by cities, the engine of growth. And we can see it reflected in the energy per capita. The more energy you consume, the wealthier you are. And it's also a higher quality energy. So my wife, Helen, consumes mostly natural gas, nuclear, and hydro. Bernadette mostly consumes wood and dung. She's based in the Congo. Pollution has just plummeted over the last 40 years. Even on fracking, we've seen big improvements. The science is somewhat contested, though. It's hard. I think they overstate, my conclusion is they overstate natural gas leakage because the long-term concern is really carbon, because we're worried about the higher levels of warming, and methane is a short-lived gas, as you all know. Fracking's been great for the natural environment. It's prevented the destruction of mountains. I mean, everybody knows that natural gas is better than coal. Nobody even has to talk about it. And so we've seen that the carbon intensity of energy has declined for 150 years as we've moved towards cleaner sources of energy. Same thing on farming. The news is very good. We've actually reduced how much land we use for meat production, which is a full 1/4 of the ice-free surface of the earth. It's astonishing. Humans use 1/4 of the ice-free surface of the earth for just livestock and pasture, and as opposed to cities, which are under 1%. I was just going to close, Maynard. I can stop now if you want. I'll close with this. So why is everybody so crazy? Why are these issues, which are clearly manageable problems, that are solved by moving towards cleaner sources of energy gradually, having industrialization for Africa and the countries that don't yet have manufacturing? Why is intensifying agriculture? Why are those things even controversial? Why is there even some debate about this? So part of it is that there's a natural appeal to nature fallacy. People think that solar panels are somehow more natural than nuclear power plants. People think in the past, this has been very bad because people preferred natural plastics or natural ivory, but it's artificial plastics made from petroleum products and artificial plastics for pool balls and billiard balls that replace the ivory in elephant tusks. So we need to retrain people, just as people are doing on fur. No disrespect, I know some people like fur, but if you think we need to move away from fur, or you need to move away from eating wild animals in China, which contributes to pandemics, then you want to embrace artificiality. Some of it's money. The climate activist community has an astonishing amount of money. They take money from renewable energy and natural gas companies that have an interest in shutting down nuclear plants. And then there's just power and ideology. This is based on this tradition from an old dead British economist named Robert Thomas Malthus, who said, humans are doomed to have famines periodically. And so there's been this effort among environmentalists in the rich world to basically deprive poor countries the cheap energy they need. And they've had that campaign for about 50 years. So I think that the climate scare has peaked with the coronavirus pandemic. I think that now people know that they're having to stay at home because of a disease and not because of climate change, which is what climate activists said. And that what will happen with climate is that it will follow the same trajectory as occurred with the concerns around overpopulation in the 60s. Emissions are going down in most rich countries. They're going to go down globally. And so I think we're going to see a similar trajectory where the scare around family planning and overpopulation died down. There's still people that worry about it, but it's just a much smaller problem. Thank you very much. I'll stop there.
Well, look, that was an awesome kickoff. We will attach everybody who just saw that. Don't worry, we're attaching my slides, and you can go through them. They're fantastic. I guess, Michael, we pledged to you in part of coming on the show that all of us would read your book. And I can tell you we've all read it. I even bought a Kindle, and I took notes. I feel like I'm back in college. And so thank you for invigorating us. One of the things that's interesting in your book, you talk a lot about the IPCC, how people take what they want from it, how they suggest it says one thing and then maybe it doesn't. It's sort of, it seems like when people are talking about the science of the climate, this is often the document or group that they're talking about, but yet they frequently misquote them or misrepresent. Can you talk about the IPCC? Because, you know, the phrase, scientists have looked at this and scientists think X, the number of people who use that in their everyday discussion of these issues is huge. So would you just mind starting there?
Well, and the reason there's so much confusion is that there's a lot of activist scientists, and they're the most involved in talking to journalists. They're the ones that, the Malthusian scientists, the ones who think that there's too many people and now we're going to run out of food, for which there is zero evidence. Those scientists are the ones that are activists. They advise Greta Thunberg. They're the ones that talk to New York Times reporters. They're the most bullying privately. They're really quite bullying. It's a hard word to say. They tend to be lead authors of reports. They tend to sort of they're out there prosecuting almost a religious agenda. And so there's a mixture of science and religion in so much of this stuff. And that's why part of the reason I wrote Apocalypse Never was to separate out those two things so we could see what's true from what's fact. So, I mean, my view is that the science of IPCC, which is what's called Working Group 1, which is just, is it sunspots? Is the planet warming? Is it sunspots? Is it the buildup of carbon dioxide? Of course, every interaction is a natural and human interaction, but it does seem to me that the evidence is very strong that humans are warming the planet. And I think there's been too much attention from conservatives on whether all of that's from humans or might sunspots or you know, are the temperature readings correct? And not enough focus on the fact that why do we think this would be the end of the world or even our most serious environmental problem, given that traditionally most of us that are environmentalists understood that it was agriculture, you know, it was just the expansion of human development that was the big problem. So now suppose there's climate. So much of that agenda has been taken over by Malthusians. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but that's the broad way to think about it. The confusion that exists on this is deliberate. It's a consequence of a deliberate effort to mislead people about these problems.
I guess the other theme that I noticed in your book is you frequently, whether it's whales or tortoise shells or the parks in Africa, ivory, you repeated a number of times in the book, you point out how economic development solves a lot of problems. And it's another way of saying it seems like a lot of the current writing about the world is devoid of sort of a economic reality, or it's not based in the economics of development, or maybe even said another way, it's anti-development.
Yes.
And that becomes so pessimistic. But let me let you elaborate on all that.
Yeah, I mean, so even when Thomas Malthus was writing in the late 1700s, some people say, well, there wasn't the Industrial Revolution yet, so maybe he just was, you know, he thought that humans were. But even at that time, there were people saying, look, people will choose to have fewer children, and we can grow more food on less land. And he said, no, that can't happen. No. So the insistence, the dogmatism that human society, that civilization, that capitalism, that industrialization, whatever you want to call it, is sort of doomed, is a pre-existing belief. That's why I ultimately think that this is a religion, just as the anti-nuclear movement was a religious movement, and the overpopulation movement are religious movements. And to some extent, that's not a criticism, because I think it's, you know, my love of endangered species, for example, can only be justified in non-rational ways. I can't tell you, some conservation scientists do this and they're lying. If the mountain gorillas and the yellow-eyed penguins, which are two species in the book, if they go extinct, there's nothing that's going to happen to human civilization. We're just going to all miss having those two amazing species. And so there's nothing wrong with that. But what they do then is they insist that really this whole terrible civilization can't continue. And in every case, there's motivations there that aren't the motivations to either lift people out of poverty or protect the natural environment. They often appear to have to do with gaining some amount of social status, political power, and also obviously some market power when it comes to things like renewables.
So a couple of fuel sources stuck out in the book. One, you talk a lot about wood or charcoal, just the so many parts of the world that don't have more modern fuel and what the effects of that are. And then, of course, the other one you talk about a ton is nuclear. And they're sort of, it seems like in the case of the first one, it's like, gosh, why don't we get focused on something so straightforward as can we please stop using wood and charcoal? And in the second one, you say something it's kind of more to the point of, if we really believe all this, why aren't we using more nuclear? It's the one source of no emissions power. I know this is one of Colin Fenton's favorite topics. So do you mind just addressing those two fuel sources and how you feel about them? Because I know that they show up as big themes in the book.
So on the first one, we have just forgotten that we all have this shared agenda to lift everybody out of poverty, and that there's still 2 billion people in the world that are stuck using wood and dung as their primary source of energy. And Americans, with our narcissism, and this is true for Europeans, our social media obsessions, our status obsessions, we've forgotten about these people, which is tragic because, it wasn't that long ago that Bono and other rock stars used to do these events to try to raise our awareness that we should care about these people. But now it's become a kind of totally taken, the progressive view of the world has been taken over by a much darker green agenda. So I wanted to draw attention to that fact, and that often these people who get invoked in the name of taking action on climate change, like people in the Congo, have much more basic concerns. They don't have basic fuels to use. And so I go through the evidence about how fossil fuels are obviously better than wood and dung. Obviously, none of us would dare return to those. And yet there's people at the United Nations, there's people in Greenpeace that are promoting the continued use of wood fuel, including in situations where it actually harms wildlife because you're competing with wildlife for those wood fuels. So I think liberating people from wood fuel, helping everybody to get free of wood fuel, which is just the same thing as saying helping cities to grow and become industrialized and people to move to LPG usually, or natural gas or petroleum. That should be one of our highest environmental priorities. And in fact, it's not only not a priority, it's actually actively lobbied against by the biggest environmental groups. And then on nuclear, what I wanted to communicate into this book is that this is a technology that nobody understands, especially the people that are in favor of it, who think that they're helping it. These are the most confused people I find. They think that there's sort of something wrong with the particular design. They think there's something about the water coolant or having fuel rods, but there's something inside the machine that explains why nuclear is so unpopular. Only 40% of Americans want to build new nuclear plants, whereas 80% want more solar and wind. And what I want to communicate in this book is that the invention of nuclear is such a radical, revolutionary moment in human history. We're not, 10,000 years from now, we'll look back and think the invention of nuclear was still this major moment. And so 75 years is this really short period of time. And so my view is that everybody remains semi-traumatized, or at least we've repressed the trauma that we've experienced of having these ridiculously powerful weapons pointed at each other, and that the fears and the hatred of that reality have displaced themselves onto the power plants. So when I'm arguing with anti-nuclear people, we're campaigning in Britain right now to build 6 new full-sized French reactors in addition to the 2 that are under construction. People argue with me about it, and I am always get this feeling. I just spoke to a really senior member of the Democratic Party who was involved in this new climate bill, who kind of pretended that he was pro-nuclear, but at the end of the conversation, it just comes out that really he hates nuclear. He just kind of is pretending because it's so irrational, his hatred of it, and that the hatred stems of its relationship to weapons, and that there truly is the desire by many on the left, some conscious, some unconscious, that we can and should try to put the genie back in the bottle. They have no idea how to do this. They don't talk about what that would actually look like. It's of course impossible because the ability to split the atom is something that can be done at the lab level. But that is the central dynamic in nuclear. And all of the Bill Gates stuff, all of the happy talk about some advanced designs, it's just a way of not dealing with the central reality. And when countries want to do nuclear, they do what the British are doing. And they go with a major nuclear builder like the French, or they do like the UAE did, or they do like Saudi Arabia might do, and they just go with a major builder. And that we've basically just been distracted into a kind of, I sometimes joke it's a little bit like a ham radio convention approach to nuclear, where it's like everybody's got their little design. I've got my design, you've got your design, and that's just not the main event. That's not the future of the technology, and it doesn't address the major obstacles to its expansion.
Do you think you had a lot of success keeping nuclear plants from being closed? And you mentioned your efforts there in the UK. Are you optimistic that we're going to really see a nuclear resurgence? Or is the upside case we're going to stop shutting them down?
I think in general, we're at a moment of chaos on a whole bunch of issues. I mean, basically every major institution in the world is failing. Its credibility and legitimacy is in decline. That goes for the WHO, that goes for IPCC, that goes for the White House, the Congress, the news media, the New York Times, nuclear. And so there's so much, I think, uncertainty and chaos right now. And that goes for energy as well. So what's helping nuclear is the reversion towards nationalism. So however strong you think that reversion will be, however you think that will shake out, it creates almost a mood that I think exists before it even gets into the discourse. I just think it exists even in the voting public of Britain, which is a sense in which, with all the chaos, with Brexit, with who knows what's going on, including the spread of, it's now obvious with North Korea, it was obvious before, that nobody can control the spread of nuclear, and that in that world, which is a scarier world than the kind of, Disneyfied world of the post-World War II Western Alliance, which is also perhaps falling apart, that you need nuclear power. I don't think anybody kind of goes, I think we need nuclear power so we can have more bombs or something like in Britain. But there is a sense in which nuclear is a protective force. And so I think it's conservative, it's nationalist. I think I'm seeing that in Britain. And we're seeing, we see interest in nuclear in places like Hungary. You see it in places like Pakistan. You see it in Brazil. You see it in Argentina. Countries that are reverting to nationalism are getting stronger support for nuclear. Trump is so chaotic that he wasn't able to do anything very effective. At the state level, it was really a combination of environmental arguments and the fact that, these are basically really just paid for assets. It's insane to close a nuclear plant. Absolutely crazy. But I think it's harder in the United States to see that global trend because our utility sector is so fragmented. We just have so many different utilities. So what we call the nuclear industry is really just this alliance of electric utilities that happen to own nuclear plants, but at this point are more loyal to gas and renewables. They're just a lot easier. And even Exelon has expressed, kind of a real nuclear. So I'm not optimistic necessarily about nuclear in the United States. We could lose half of our capacity in, 10 years, 15 years. So it's a nightmare. And I basically give zero chance to those small nuclear modular reactors or some alternative design to replacing even a fraction of what we're set to lose. But I am more optimistic about Britain. I'm more optimistic in general about island nations. I could see Philippines actually getting nuclear at this point. I could definitely see Argentina expanding nuclear. I could see South Africa coming back to nuclear. So it's not like nuclear. I think the overall trend will be good for nuclear, but it'll be good in ways that the current discourse is not properly, I think, describing. You make reference in the book to Eisenhower's speech at the UN where he made an offer to the Soviets to let's work together and we'll do atoms for peace. And it was very striking because Eisenhower seemed to be, he's the exact reverse of everything you just described in today's institutions. He was a trusted, good-hearted, someone that inspired you.
It's a long way of asking, do you think someone or something can rally us, the great big definition of us, can rally us to believe in institutions again? Or are we somehow sort of spiraling off here into it?
Yeah, I mean, we're at the end of what you would call the neoliberal paradigm, which starts sometime in the mid-'70s or early '70s, depending on where you date it. It's coming to an end. It came to an end with Brexit and Trump. I mean, just kind of go, that's the end of an era. So what comes next? Some kind of reversion towards nationalism with liberal and conservative variants to it. All of the existing institutions can be rehabilitated with new leadership, with new ideas, but you're talking about a different paradigm. Right now, nobody knows why America should even exist. Like if you go onto the streets of anywhere, like Houston, Berkeley, and you go, why should, because everybody hates each other, right, in America. So we all hate each other. Red and blue people, they hate each other. They really, like even family members now, starting to properly hate each other. Why bother with America? Like, I mean, why not just break it? Why not break the country into two?
Hold on. You're losing me. I'm teasing you. Go ahead.
So nobody can answer that question. Like nobody can offer a good answer to that question. Certainly the president can't, but I don't think Nancy Pelosi can. I don't think the New York Times editorial board can answer that question. People kind of go, well, freedom. You know, my wife was reading, I got my wife on Twitter. She was reading some stuff I was doing on pandemic. I was a pandemic alarmist. I'm against alarmism on climate change because it's, 100 to 1,000 year problem. But on pandemics, I'm an alarmist because the faster you move, the less cases and the better chance of suppressing whatever. So I was tweeting on that, which my conservative friends don't like. And somebody said, well, I hope everybody stays locked down because my sister is immune compromised. And then this person responded to her and he goes, what, now I can't go to work because of your sister? And my wife was like, what have we come to, as a society where that's the reaction? And that was a little bit my reaction too. But I think that the guy has a reasonable question, which is, what is our obligation to one another? And I think that's a question that applies to both this pandemic. Like, obviously right and left now have split on it. They have two different ideas, although there's probably a lot more agreement than you would get from Twitter or the New York Times. But I think that question of what is the new social contract? What is it that we owe each other as Americans? What do the rich owe the poor? What do the poor need to, what do they owe the society for accepting public benefits? What should we expect from students? What should we expect from teachers? What do we expect from our corporate leaders? What do we expect from the president? There's no clarity on this, I don't think. So I think so my next book is going to be about this question of like, what is it that America's for? And my view is that there's something here around responsibility. There's something here about some agreement between left and right about what is a view of individual and social responsibility. Just look at the opioid epidemic. Everybody is sort of guilty. I mean, it's really a shame and a stain on this country what has occurred with this. The number of drug addictions went from 17,000 to drug overdose deaths went from 17,000 to 70,000 in 20 years, and nobody noticed this. And we all just now we kind of go, but there was bad behavior by everybody, by Wall Street, by the left, in encouraging this kind of stuff, by the individuals who have nothing to live for that they get addicted. So America is so in trouble, and there's no sense in what we owe each other. I do think nationalism is the right faith that binds us together as a people of America. I think it's the only way to end all this kind of panic that we're in about race and racism and sex and sexism and trans and what's all that about? It's because there's no sense in which there's a coherent national identity. What's America for? What do we owe each other? That's my view. I think we've got a paradigm problem. It's not like and everybody wants to blame some leader or some institution, but it goes much deeper to this question of social contract.
Michael, I thought one thread that I took away from your book is the answer to that question might be honesty and humility. And I was impressed with all the examples you gave of kind of memes where you track down the validity or lack of validity of certain assertions. So, for example, that, skinny polar bear, and you go back to the filmmaker and you say, well, what happened there, and they wanted to blame National Geographic for a caption. Or your example of the 1983 conference, where Merchants of Doubt portrayed that as, the author said one thing or believed something. You actually went to the guy and said, "Is that true?" And he was like, "What are you talking about? It's not true." And I noticed in particular that he went to the authors in 2007 and said, "This isn't actually my opinion." And that book was published in 2010. And I don't think we want to, take on any individual person, but the pulling the thread away from it is that the alarmism and the apocalyptic talk and this picking of good guys and bad guys, I think you pretty ably demonstrated why that's a problem, and that, our better angels might be able to find a vision of the future where we can all agree that your plea for universal prosperity is a pretty admirable goal. And if we can see through these individual human beings that you introduced us to, the choices that they face and the values that they have, I do think that that's something that can begin to push us through. So my question, that's a little bit of a preamble. My question to you is, can you maybe talk to us a little bit about your own journey in how you thought about nuclear, how you thought about some of these resources, and getting past that Malthusian fear about resources, getting past, the more neo-Malthusian argument about system collapse, and how you're thinking about universal prosperity?
Well, I was going to say one thing too, which is I think that trust is about more than believing that somebody is being accurate. I think trust is also believing that that person cares about you. They actually care about you. And that means that they treat you as an end and not as a means to an end, that someone is not, that they want the best for you in your life, and that you're not just sort of manipulating you. Well, because if somebody's lying to you, they are trying to manipulate you. They are trying to use you. And so, but that's just one way in which people can manipulate you. We also know that you can manipulate people by telling them certain truths. And that's really what I document in my book, is the way it's which people lie through the truth. You tell certain truths and you just leave the other ones out.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, I was never Malthusian. I was raised in the Judeo-Christian tradition, which is that we should love everybody. In fact, the most difficult thing in my life is trying to learn how to love my enemies. I don't know if I'll ever be able to do that. I've had moments of it, but most of the time that's a very difficult thing, especially when they're lying about you in public. So, but nonetheless, the idea should be that we should love all humans. And I think that somehow just has faded with the decline of traditional religion and with the rising power of what I think is a really destructive and nihilistic radical left.
You had an example in the book about, I think there was an individual that said, "Hey, the ends justify the means." And if I had to say, when you listen to some of the things we're talking about here, that belief is a really corrosive, terrible belief. And it's at the heart of a lot of bad things in today's world. And I think if we had more examples of people that didn't believe that, that's the way back. I don't know how you think about that, but it was a great example in your book about why there's honestly a lot of misinformation in this debate.
I mean, my hope is, what I will say as a point of optimism is that I think in this chaos right now that we're in, first of all, the chaos will end, as we know it will, of course. Hopefully it'll end by January. But nonetheless, I think the chaos will start to end. And it seems like in this new media environment, it should reward people who are also telling the truth in ways that I think these institutions like the New York Times is clearly not interested in that anymore. They're interested in prosecuting a particular, agenda and vision of the world. So I think the new social media environment offers some of these opportunities for people to develop trust, over time, but it's going to require a totally different social contract, a totally different vision, something that ties together red states and blue states, conservatives and liberals. I mean, it's fine to have competition. We should have political competition. But at this point, it's like we're dealing with two parts of the country that are like alien species to each other, and the hatred for one another. It's gone so extreme. I do believe that some sort of correction that will result in a calmer and more moderate conversation is in the works. I think that a Biden victory may end up ushering some of that in, where I think Americans are just tired of the chaos.
Well, I think, in terms of, you're a fabulous guest. I mean, we got so much from you, and we could go on so much longer. I just want to close with a few thoughts. One is we bought 400 copies of your book, and we've all read it. And so if you're watching this and you'd like a copy of the book, if you're in the first 400 requests, we'll send you one. That's the first thought. The second couple thoughts is, I think a lot of those slides you were going through, those are reasons for optimism. Because when you think about so many of those stats, in some ways the world is getting better. Many ways the world is getting better, and that is when that story gets out better. That's a reason for optimism. And then I want to thank you for your book, but also try to answer your question about what's the purpose of America. And I think it is the central open marketplace for ideas on the planet. It's the one place where you have the greatest ability to speak your mind, share your thoughts, and throw your idea out there and see if people like it. So COVID and all this other stuff and red, blue, and Trump, Nancy Pelosi, none of this stuff is a threat to America. The only threat to America is that we stop speaking our mind, and the fact that you wrote a book in a debate that lacks intellectual honesty is a great step towards pushing us back to the America we should be, at least in the energy debate. So that's my best credit.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Fantastic. Thanks, everybody. Take care and be safe. Talk soon.